This is Hannah and Cailin, back again with Double Talk. I'm Hannah.
And I'm Cailin.
U.S. President Joe Biden recently announced his plan for a $100 million drive to combat drug-resistant superbugs. But what exactly are superbugs? How does antibiotic resistance happen? And how could they both become a bigger problem for us in the future? To address these questions, and to learn if there are any potential solutions, or at least ways we can protect ourselves, we're talking to Dr. Erin Duffy. Dr. Duffy is the Chief of Research and Development for CARB-X, a global nonprofit partnership focused on supporting the development of new antibacterial products. Listen in.
There's been so much discussion in the media lately about these superbugs, right? And antibiotic resistant bugs, they're calling them. What exactly is a superbug?
So long story short, it means simply that the bacteria that infect people or animals too have figured out ways to change themselves such that the antibiotics that we invent to work against them no longer do.
Now, what I've heard a lot growing up about being prescribed antibiotics is, our parents would say, you only take them when you need to, because there's this fear that you're going to become resistant, and obviously that is a thing that happens. How does one become resistant to antibiotics?
It's a good question. So first of all, you don't get resistant, which is good. It's the bacteria that do. It happens over time. People have attributed, for instance, the use of antibiotics to make our livestock more robust or plant life more robust. The use of antibiotics in that process has been, a key contributor to antibiotic resistance. But you should know that bacteria have been doing this forever, okay? They fight each other this way. They make antibiotics and then they sort of figure out how to get around them. The difference is simply that in the earlier days of antibiotics, when they first came about with penicillin, there was a lot of activity in the space and research, meaning we had new antibiotics coming all the time. So you always had something new to treat the bacteria.
If you don't become resistant, the bacteria becomes resistant, then why is there that advice that you can take too much antibiotics and then it won't work for you anymore?
So it's really the kind of infection that you get. So, when you go to a doctor, you don't show up with a t-shirt that says, I have a drug resistant, whatever, right? You're sick, you have a fever, and they're going to give you antibiotics. They don't, we're getting better about having diagnostics that tell them what it is and what it will, what antibiotics will work against it. But otherwise, they're treating empirically. And so they have to treat in the prescribed way. Now, the things that they can do are say, just because you're feeling a little better today, maybe continue those antibiotics, because sometimes it's that people stop, they're not quite cured, and then the infection can sort of evolve.
Is there any truth to the thinking behind, say I think I have an ear infection, and I'm like, well, I don't want to take antibiotics if I don't absolutely have to, so I'm going to wait until I feel better. Is that effective? Is that something that people should do? Should there be a thought process where you're I'm going to try to resist going on antibiotics because I'm worried about the bacteria becoming resistant?
That's a good question. No, I think if you're feeling poorly, you go to your doctor. What you don't do is say, I read on the internet that this probably, whatever. I mean, they're there as professionals. Let them do their thing.
How can we prevent these superbugs?
What we can do, obviously good hygiene. We learned this in COVID, wash your hands. That's really, really important because, a lot of infections come about from just, poor hygiene, comparatively poor hygiene. And so that's a number one. Number two, if you are feeling poorly, go to a doctor, be diagnosed, do what you're supposed to do. And then the third, probably the most importantly, is to encourage research investment in this space so that people, will keep a pace with bacteria. Bacteria are going to do this all the time. So we just need to have enough solutions to, continue to mount a good fight against them.
What would a doctor do if they have a patient that the bacteria is resistant to treatment of a certain antibiotic? Is it a scenario where there's always another one they could try, or what does the doctor do there?
Typically what happens is, and this is evolving to be better, but typically, let's say you have a sore throat, they're going to take a swab of your throat, and then they're going to, do some things that ultimately they'll get a little report. Now, this doesn't come right away. Right now, it comes maybe a day later that says, here are all the antibiotics in our hospital that we've tested against this. So they have a way of, putting this stuff on a plate, putting antibiotics on and seeing which antibiotics clear it. So they'll know, oh, okay, I can use this antibiotic, or maybe this one will work. So they'll know right away. Now, if they've sent you home with an antibiotic and it turns out that it's not going to, this would say it's not going to work, then they'll call you and say, you know what, I'm going to change your prescription to whatever. And that's typically how it happens.
What kinds of superbugs are there, and what different ways do they look? Is there like a sore throat superbug? Is there like a stomach affecting superbug?
Yeah, no, they can be anywhere. So, I mean, different bacteria cause different infections, and, sometimes more than one. But if, you may have heard there was a publication in the Lancet, which is, a medical journal, in January of last year. It was a really interesting article because what they did for the first time, they looked at 2019 as a year, and for the first time shone a light on, what are the types of infections and the types of bacteria that cause them, that are driving the biggest mortality across the world. And just want to say one thing, if you haven't seen this, something like 1.3 million people in 2019 died as a direct result of a drug-resistant bacterial infection. That's a big number, okay? But anyway, so in that, they listed the top 6 bugs, that are responsible for, morbidity, mortality. And the number 1 was E. coli. Now, you hear about E. coli, all the time. E. coli can cause, certain E. coli, you hear about foodborne infections, but E. coli is the predominant bug causing urinary tract infections, for instance. And there's a case, right, where, you get oral antibiotics, maybe you get some cranberry juice, whatever. But that's a big driver of noncompliance and ultimately resistance. So that's number 1. Number 2 is Staph aureus. So you probably heard, the term MRSA thrown around a lot. That's a type of drug-resistant Staph aureus. That's number 2. And that causes all sorts of infections, from skin infections to lung infections to everything in between.
That's very interesting. I had no idea E. coli was tied to UTIs.
Yeah, and there could be, and you could have a drug-resistant UTI. That's scary. Yeah, that's scary. Is there, as a doctor, is there a bacteria that you're most concerned about, or does it just depend on the case and the person?
Those top 6, that they outlined, E. coli, Staph aureus, these are all funny names, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter. They're all concerning for this reason, and they have been for some time. We've known that, these are areas we want to focus. The other one, of course, is tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which isn't a problem in the United States, but is a massive problem in certain other parts of the world. And so we really just have to pay attention to these these stories and what they tell us, and then again tailor our research so that we are there to meet the demand.
When you read about this, like, some of the headlines seem like scary, like this is the apocalypse coming, right? What is the actual, in your professional opinion, what is the actual worst case scenario for these superbugs when it comes to resistance?
I'll give you a real life today happening scenario. So people don't die from it, but there's a lot of morbidity, and that's gonorrhea. So, okay, it's sexually transmitted disease. The reason I bring it up is people for years thought gonorrhea was a thing of the past and easily treatable. And, why do we need to worry about that? But we've had a resurgence, and, there are a lot of reasons about that we don't have time to talk about today. But anyway, today there is only one reliable antibiotic, not a class of antibiotics, but one reliable antibiotic for gonorrhea. That's a pretty scary situation, actually.
So literally there wouldn't be another option if it wasn't working for somebody?
If it's not working, and they'll know, occasionally it can be that if it's not working against that, something else will work, but usually that's the last line. Now, there are a couple of antibiotics that are being, studied in human clinical trials and that are different and new, and so hopefully they'll provide at least some stopgap. But it used to be we had many different kinds of antibiotics that could be used for gonorrhea: oral pills, IV, shots, all of the above. And now it's just one very painful shot from one antibiotic.
A lot of people, when they think about like the cold and flu season, for example, those are viruses, they're not bacterial infections. But what advice would you give to people who are looking to best protect themselves from these dangerous bacteria?
It's all the same thing, because often, you start with a virus, but you can have a secondary bacterial infection that comes if you don't, clear the virus well. And that was true in COVID too. A lot of people ended up with secondary respiratory infections. So it's the same advice, again, wash your hands, wear a mask, stay home if you don't feel well, don't go spreading it in the office or, at the local PTA or whatever. It's really simple stuff.
What is the number one guideline or piece of advice that if you could speak to every single doctor in America that you would like them to follow when they're treating these kinds of infections?
In the world today where we don't have diagnostics everywhere, you treat as you always do, but then you follow up, as soon as see how the patient is doing, and then you course correct from there.